winter solstice is really key to what Christmas is. It's the birth of the sun. The days start becoming longer. They're getting shorter and shorter and shorter as you go into wintertime. And then at the winter solstice, the days start becoming longer.
I'm Ronald Hutton, Professor of History at the University of Bristol, England, and one of my specialities is the history of seasonal festivals. Stonehenge is probably the most famous prehistoric monument in the world. The greatest of those doorway-like three-stone settings was aligned precisely on the setting sun at midwinter. Now, this is a type of monument you find around Western Europe, all the way from Sweden down to Spain and Corsica and Sardinia. The sun's important in places as different as ancient Egypt, ancient Mesoamerica, like the Mayan civilization, the Toltecs, and also at places like Cuzco. Fixating on the sun is kind of something that most ancient peoples do. And the further north you are, the more important this is.
I think that the celebration of the winter solstice must have begun in connection to the worship of the sun. And we know that people in Scandinavia worship the sun during the Bronze Age. We have found loads and loads of pictures and pictograms and sculptures of the sun. For obvious reasons, we actually almost lose the sun for part of the year.
So Dongzhi is one of the really most important festivals in China. So it's a winter festival. We will have the shortest time of daytime and the longest time of nighttime. So the original holiday traced back all the way like 2,800 years ago, and we say it's almost 3,000 years ago. They will go outside of the palace to worship the heaven.
The practice of Yule goes back pretty far because with Yule, what we're really talking about is the winter solstice.
Yule is quite simply the old Scandinavian, i.e. the Viking name for midwinter. It's the name of their midwinter festival. It's one of the greatest festivals of their year because way up in Scandinavia in the olden times, there wasn't a whole lot you could do around winter. It's exceptionally long and hard up there. And so Yule, getting to its centre and knowing that things are going to get better eventually, is the obvious time for a tremendous heathen party.
We have the tradition of the Yule log. That is definitely a symbol, that fire of the rebirth of the sun. So that's another tradition that does represent that aspect of the winter solstice and the sun being reborn.
It's probably a fertility symbol. In some places, a human figure is chalked on it, called the mock, and some historians say, well, it may be the last remnant of a human sacrifice. But there are some lovely ceremonies attached to it. What you say to the tree when you bring it in. You sprinkle it with grain, which is a sign of fertility, or wine, and say a little prayer over it, and so on.
During Yule celebrations, they would bring in this boar who was called the Sonargalt. It means the boar of atonement. And people would actually swear oaths on the bristles of this boar. And you could it's also said that you could make divination by touching the bristles of this big boar. And it was obviously sacrificed and eaten. This boar was dedicated to the god Freyr.
And then it was like, okay, well, where did all the traditions come from? This is before we even saw the Wiccan page. We decided to start looking into it for ourselves, into scripture, and then we were kind of like, well, where did this stuff come from?
The modern Christmas celebrations tie around Saturnalia, the pagan god Saturn, who, among other things, was eating his children until he was overthrown by his own son.
Some people claim that was Christians were trying to Christianize this Roman festival, but the dates don't really line up, so there are definitely some difficulties associated with the claim that, they're trying to Christianize a pagan celebration.
Now, here I must make the absolutely essential point that Christmas is not a day, it's a season. And it's a very long season. Had you shown up in the Middle Ages in early December, you would have been living in the Christmas period.
The date of the Saturnalia is the 17th of December, but it evolves into a festival that lasts several days, actually, and goes right up until, let's say, the 23rd. And a date in that third week of December, I think, must be connected to astronomical knowledge about the timing of the winter solstice. We know about the festival of Saturnalia in Roman pagan times from a number of different authors. So we have Seneca and Macrobius chiefly, and poets like Horace and Martial talk a little bit about it. It shares a lot of elements in common with Christmas, we might think. Gift-giving, feasting, a sense of carnival, a sense of celebration, a focus on light in the middle of the darkness of winter. One of the traditions at Saturnalia was present exchange, which of course is very similar to modern Christmas. So people go around exchanging gifts. Little figurines called sigillaria were popular. These could be quite cheap little pottery things, but there were other sorts of gifts as well. Cloaks and a pencil case and wine and a parasol and a parrot.
Saturn being the god of agriculture, he's also associated with the color red. So that's where we get a lot of that red color, along with holly, which is a symbol of Saturn. You have the red berries.
Can you describe what trees and holly and mistletoe have to do with the Christmas story in the Bible?
You got me on that one. I don't know.
Maybe Mary and Joseph kissed under the mistletoe. I don't know. I don't know.
Symbols like holly and mistletoe and greenery in general, they're really just symbolic representations of fertility and vitality at this time of year. So they really just inspire hope that if mistletoe, if holly can grow in the depths of winter, so can I.
Christians fought these Saturnalia celebrations. They were originally prohibited in Christian circles for obvious reasons, because again, they understood where they were coming from. Most infamously would be the mistletoe. Now, modern people think it's a quaint custom to hang a mistletoe, and if you see a pretty girl, give her a kiss under the mistletoe. Well, anyone versed in religious knowledge is going to know that's a fertility ritual, when you're kissing a girl under the mistletoe. Now, the mistletoe not only is beautiful, it's a mysterious thing to traditional peoples. It's actually a parasite. It grows on trees. It doesn't grow in the earth. But to the ancients, that makes it magical. It grows in the sky. That's why the Druids in Celtic tradition, the Druids are a class of priests, would collect the mistletoe. But it gets even stranger. If you crush the berries of the mistletoe, it resembles in texture human semen. That's the tie into fertility. That's why, again, in distorted form, people are kissing girls under the mistletoe. In fact, it's kind of an obscene rite saying we want to have sexual intercourse with you.
Mistletoe really is quite rare as a plant, and so it becomes fashionable really in richer, more sophisticated times like the 17th, 18th century, and nobody kisses under it until around about the time of George Washington. It's the late 18th century in London that produces the custom, first for servants in big houses, and then their mistresses and masters, rather sportingly, instead of discouraging the practice, imitate it.
The pagans would practice what's called the world upside down. During this period, teachers would follow orders from students. The students would give them assignments. During this period, masters would serve slaves at the table, and slaves would give them orders.
So you have the Feast of Fools. This is often connected to street parades, finding the local village idiot and parading him around as king.
Now's the time we crown the king of fools!
wild carryings on. But Callans was really a bigger festival than Saturnalia. It was the New Year festival, with all that may imply, the notion of sort of reconstituting everything, the world being born again.
The Romans would celebrate the Calendae on the 1st of January, which is where we have New Year's Day to this very moment. So that kind of shiver most people get as the clock ticks towards midnight on the 31st of December is really old.
The notion that gifts given on New Year's are Christmas gifts is an idea that exists even today in France, where they're more likely to hand out gifts on New Year's.
Before the 1800s, you do not get presents at Christmas. You get partying and feasting. The presents get given on New Year's Day.
When Christians think about the pagan tie-ins, what they're wrestling with is the purity of the faith, right? They're saying, is this really a good thing?
Melissa and I get a lot of letters from people who are newly out of the New Age, which is paganism, and they don't want to be deceived, so they get hyper vigilant about anything that smacks of paganism. So we get a lot of letters from people who are afraid that it's that the Roman Catholic Church appropriated pagan holidays of the winter solstice and put a Christian veneer over it to make it palatable to new Christians, for pagans leaving paganism to come and become Christians.
Right, so the winter solstice is what date?
The 21st.
21st, yeah.
21st, 22nd. So since the solstice is the 22nd, that's the day where the sun stands still for those 2 days. The 25th is a different date.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So if they were wanting to expropriate the winter solstice, they would have made Jesus born on December 22nd.
True.
That's true.
Caesar, Julius Caesar, the famous one, in his calendar reform of 45-44, established the winter solstice as on the 25th of December, okay? And he said that's Buma, and Buma means the midwinter.
Everybody knows that the winter solstice is on the 21st of December, but that is actually not the original idea of Julius Caesar, who was the originator, the inventor of our calendar, so to speak. He fixed the date on the 25th of December, so that would be the older Julian date for the solstice, but that calendar is not entirely precise. So basically, roughly speaking, 1 day per century it shifts. So by the 4th century, when Christmas originated, the date from the 25th had shifted to the 21st, and that's the day that has been later restituted by Pope Gregory XIII in the 16th century to be the standard winter solstice, which is valid until today, and that's what our calendar still says. The winter solstice has nothing whatsoever to do with Christmas, because the Bible simply doesn't speak about any form of solstice, shortest day, the sun or whatever. It just speaks about the birth of a child in a manger. But Christmas preserves the older Julian date for winter solstice, that is the 25th of December.
We don't know when Jesus was born. The gospel stories don't tell us. They give us some clues that we think it was probably generally in the autumn season, but we really don't know.
No one knows when the date was, but almost all the evidence is sometime late September, early October.
The answer is no one knows.
So why are we celebrating it on the 25th?
By about 200, there's a calendar of Antiochus, which says the 25th of December is the birthday of Helios. of the sun. So there is definitely an idea of birthday already by 200 AD.
Probably the first usage of the date 25th December for a big festive occasion is in the early 270s AD or CE, when a Roman emperor called Aurelian dedicates a huge temple at Rome to the unconquered sun, Sol Invictus. Aurelian's a military hard guy who's pulled the empire back together after decades of invasion and civil war, and he's trying to produce a religion around which all the pagans the empire can unite, and the sun up there in the sky giving warmth and life to the world could be the symbol. And so he dedicates this big temple at Rome to the sun on the 25th of December.
One of the theories now is that Aurelian actually chose December 25th to co-opt a popular Christmas date, that Christmas had already been enough of a whoop for an emperor who wanted to emphasize the sun god and victory, to steal it as a date.
It is my view, and I think it is the view of the majority of scholars of this period, that Aurelian did dedicate his temple on the 25th of December 274.
Unfortunately, there's no direct evidence for the date of that inauguration. It will have been inaugurated sometime, and it is probably a plausible hypothesis to think that it was the 25th of December. It's a good option, it's a good guess, but there's no hard evidence for that date.
It is still very controversial as to what's going on about the choice of the 25th of December as being an important day for Sol Invictus.
Now, the important thing to bear in mind here is that quite independently of Sol Invictus, December 25th was already widely regarded to be the date of the winter solstice. And this date had already a certain degree of solar symbolism built into it, because obviously this date marks the transition from decreasing daylight length to increasing daylight length. And as a result, it made a lot of sense on a symbolic level to argue that the sun is born on this date, and as the sun grows older, the days grow longer.
For my part, the evidence points very strongly that Aurelian chose that date because of the association with the solstice and with the festival of light that already existed at that time. And I think we then come to the slightly more controversial problem of, well, then how do you understand that same date being adopted as the birthday of Christ?
354 is the first year in which Christ gets officially given a birthday on the 25th of December.
The Roman Empire has become Christian. Okay, so Constantine.
I can't think of anything where the word Christmas ever comes up in the reign of Constantine. But because of that December the 25th, and because that was the feast day for the god Sol Invictus, it eventually becomes a convenient day for Christians to celebrate the birth of Christ. The first record we have of this happening is in a surviving calendar from the year 354.
It's called the Philocalian calendar, and it's a bizarre, it's kind of like an almanac. It's got all kinds of pictures and dates and distances of one city to another.
It says this is the day of Sol Invictus, and it's also the day on which Christians celebrate the birth of Christ. It was prepared for a Christian, and yet it had all the pagan holidays in it, and all the things that Christians were supposed to despise.
The need for Christmas was felt in the 4th century and not before that, because the general religious culture changed. And the growing interest in the sun is certainly part of that new religious culture in the 4th century, in late antiquity, and without that growing interest in the sun, probably Christmas would not have originated, or if it originated, it would probably not have fallen on the 25th of December.
And this solar symbolism could be in principle also applied to Jesus, because in early Christian sources, Jesus is sometimes being given as solar attributes. He's referred to as the Son of Justice, as Christ the true Sun.
You sometimes get representations of Christ with rays. You sometimes do get a nimbus, meaning a golden zone around the head of Christ and later of other saints as well. You do get, for example, in the apse of Santa Pollinare in Classe in Ravenna, a sun rising above the horizon, which is Christ, recognizable because there's a cross in that sun, and it also says that it is Christ.
If Christ is majesty and Christ is also justice, there are two reasons for assimilating him to the sun. And if the birthday of the sun is the 25th, it's perfectly possible to make this the date of his birth.
When heretics of the Gnostic variety started suggesting that Christ had never had bodily form, that he had merely been spirit, Christians then realized they had to start emphasizing things like the birth. The observance of the Nativity then becomes openly celebrated. Toward the end of the 20th century, people thought that the church was unlikely to adopt anything pagan. So they looked for another theory to explain it, and they came up with what's called the calculations theory.
And the calculation theory comes in and tries to explain why Christians arrived at the conclusion that Jesus was born on December 25th. And it leaves the question of how Christmas first came to be celebrated pretty much alone. That's a separate issue.
There was kind of this tradition in Judaism that a prophet's death was the same day as his birth.
So they would be born and die on the same date. Well, that would help us pick the date for the birth of Jesus. We know that he was crucified in the late spring, and a popular date for that in the early church was March 25th. So was March 25th then the birthday of Jesus? No, they thought. That would be the conception of Jesus. So 9 months from March 25th gives us December 25th.
So if the theory has to do with birth and death, didn't anyone notice that they switched birth and conception?
Right, so Hans Förster's main criticism of the calculation theory is that it cannot account for one of its founding assumptions. He criticizes the calculation theory for assuming that at some stage Christians would have sort of switched their assumption and all of a sudden would have started parallelizing the conception and the death, which is not even attested in the sources before the 4th century according to him. I believe the Christians did have a reason for switching, and that's precisely because they had this independent assumption that Christ would have probably been born in winter because of the way they read, or rather misread, the first chapter of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, in the first chapter, you have this encounter between the priest Zacharias and an angel in the temple, and the angel prophesies that Zacharias' wife Elizabeth will conceive a son who goes on to become John the Baptist. And the same chapter also informs you that Christ was conceived about 5 or 6 months after this episode. So if you take this information, you could argue that Christ was born maybe 15 months after this encounter between Zacharias and the angel. And we know that some Christians, possibly already in the 2nd century, believed that this episode happened on the Day of Atonement in the Jewish calendar, also known as Yom Kippur, which roughly speaking happens every year in late September, early October. Then you count forward the month and you figure out that Christ must have been born in winter. And this influenced the way they carried out these calculations that eventually led them to accept December 25th.
So you're saying they misread Luke because they thought Zacharias served in the temple on Yom Kippur, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have quite a few sources which express this assumption that Zacharias was the high priest of the temple, and that he went into the temple on the Day of Atonement, because according to the Old Testament, that's what the high priest does. He goes into the Holy of Holies once every year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
But how do we know Zacharias wasn't a high priest?
The crucial piece of evidence the Gospel of Luke gives you in this regard is to say that Zacharias entered the temple as a member of Abia. Abia is one of 24 priestly divisions or priestly causes. And the purpose of these priestly courses was to take turns when it came to officiating in the temple, burning incense, sacrificing animals, and so on.
So, by virtue of being in the course of Abijah, Zacharias was an ordinary priest and not a high priest, right?
Exactly.
And doesn't that also mean that, according to Leviticus, I think, if he tried to serve as a high priest, he would die?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they tried to use chronological arguments to get to this result, even though it says clearly that he's a member of Abia.
You're unlikely to come on the basis of the information given in the Bible to the 25th of December. But once it was installed, then it was relatively easy to find theories covering that date too. And you could even go further and say, if you take the Gospel Luke 2 seriously, it is unlikely that it happened in winter, because the shepherds were out in the fields, and even in Palestine, where it's warmer than in Middle Europe or Northern Europe, even in Palestine, at the end of December, shepherds would not normally be out on the fields with their sheep during night.
The church had a really good marketing strategy. They were great marketers. So any culture they went to, they would incorporate what those people cared about most into Christianity. And that's part of the reason why there are so many variations of Christianity too, in part because each culture around the world is going to care and value different things and have different celebrations, and Christianity took those and incorporated that as a way to help inspire that conversion process.
It took 400 or 500 years to get to all of Europe. The last part of Europe that it went to was Scandinavia. And always when the Christian church went somewhere, they had to negotiate with local political rulers. And so Christmas came to different parts of Europe at different times, but the Catholic Church always found it convenient to fold local custom into their own church.
Håkon the Good, he had a plan of converting Norway to Christianity, but in a sort of soft way. So he began with the Christmas celebration. Now, they didn't celebrate Christmas, obviously, because they were pagan, but they did celebrate Yule, and they had this big celebration of Yule around the 12th of January. So Håkon the Good, he changed the date and said he demanded that they start to celebrate on the 25th of December. So instead of celebrating the first sightings of the sun in the north, they were supposed to celebrate the birth of Christ, obviously. And people accepted the change of date. That's okay. So as long as they got a party, they were fine with that.
Rulers made the decision to become Christians. It's kind of funny, you know, a prince or a duke would make a decision for the whole kingdom to say, okay, you'll now all believe this. But you have to do things, even when you're an authoritarian ruler, you have to do things to make the people accept it. So it just was easier to do that, to celebrate these old pagan holidays.
Some people in the church that we were going to started to say things like, okay, well, you know, the roots of Christmas is pagan. We were like, we don't care, okay? We don't care where it came from. The point is that we're celebrating Christ, we're celebrating his birth. I don't care what those people were doing.
I had little sneaking suspicions that it had pagan roots. But it's not until we started really getting into it and doing a little bit of research that I really felt uncomfortable with it. But I didn't say anything because I thought that the rest of the family would not only have a problem with it, but I didn't want to be the black sheep and be like, oh, well.
As Christianity goes on, now we're talking the what's called late antiquity or the early Middle Ages. the church is warning people about clinging to the calends. And they're saying, you gotta stop this cross-dressing.
The common Christmas ritual known as mumming actually involves cross-dressing between men and women.
You gotta stop dressing up like animals, you gotta stop dancing in the streets.
It's a church writer warning people not to practice this tradition, which would be, they talk about going about to houses with the heads of beasts.
The December period, the Christmas period, was a time in which groups at the margins of society, the despised, the poor, the unmarried, kids, would be allowed to go around and demand gifts. So they would go to door to door, singing a song or making threats or offering a little something. Young women, for example, would carry a bucket of beer, a wassail bowl, and give you a sip when they knocked on your door in return for either some food or some money.
Wassailing was a form of begging, which always sort of had an implicit threat. If you give us what we want, alcohol, food, even money, we'll wish you wonderful luck in the next year. If you don't, we can do damage.
As a child, not coming from a Christian home, I had a lot of just common questions. I mean, what does St. Nicholas have to do with the birth of Christ?
St. Nicholas was, though we've mostly forgotten him, the greatest male saint for 1,000 years. He was almost as powerful and as venerated as the Virgin Mary. Hundreds of churches around the world are St. Nicholas churches. The first church in North America is a St. Nicholas church. He is the patron saint of just about everything.
Now, aren't there legends about St. Nicholas?
Yes, this is the one that really makes the headlines. So here's the story. 3 students, so probably they're young men, not kids, but they're always presented as kids. They're going off to study and they stop at this inn where the innkeeper has this nasty habit of killing his guests, chopping them up and pickling them in barrels in the basement and then serving the meat in meat pies. So he kills the kids, chops them up, puts them in the barrel. And St. Nicholas comes visiting a few days later, and spidey senses are tingling. There's something going on here. And he says, "You've got 3 kids in the basement chopped up. Confess." Yes. So he goes down to the basement and resurrects the children. They are reassembled, and so you very often see 3 kids coming out of a tub. He is the patron saint of barrel makers, pickle makers, innkeepers. The innkeeper turned good, by the way, and students and kids.
And there was a custom that this character would come door to door on Christmas time. And he would knock on the door, and he'd be in disguise and say, "Was little Johann a good boy?" And if the mother said yes, he'd give him some candy.
Krampus is an assistant of St. Nicholas. The 2 of them will go door to door, and Nicholas's job is to check in with the children and ask other parents how they've been doing that year. And the Krampus's job is to punish them if they've been bad. This is actually a tradition that's acted out in certain towns in Austria and Bavaria. It's pretty rare now in this form where they go house to house, but where that happens, Nicholas will, as I said, talk to the kids. There's a little traditional rhyme that he says when he enters, and he does give them little small gifts. He's costumed as like a medieval bishop. And this is how the Krampuses were originally. You just take an old coat and turn it inside out so you see the fur. And my Austrian friend said his grandfather would take a rug off the floor. And so it was just like, how do you disguise yourself and make yourself look like something other?
So it's always a fur-clad, smutty-faced, glowering character. Might carry chains or a whip.
This Krampus is often shown with the chains, and these chains are held by St. Nicholas, who's the Santa Claus. And they say that this might symbolize how Santa Claus, like as a Christian figure, was able to chain and control these pagan elements.
At the time, as opposed to modern day Santa, who is in charge of both giving gifts and keeping track of who's naughty, those responsibilities were split between the two. So St. Nicholas would give out treats, small toys, things like that, and Krampus would be the one who would be used by parents to threaten their kids. If you're bad, Krampus is going to come and take you away.
You know, these masking traditions can go back to the 1100s or so, or even older, to the Roman Empire.
When we first heard about the pagan roots, is they were saying like the Christmas tree was pagan, and that is something that we shouldn't be doing. But we were like, well, we're celebrating the birth of Christ.
Maybe they're worshiping the tree, but we're not.
We're not worshiping the tree. We're not carving it into an idol. We're just cutting down a tree and bringing it into our house. And so we're like, okay, well, where did this Christmas tree thing come from?
The earliest evidence we have of evergreens being brought into the houses is early folklore. It's from the Middle Ages. We just know that people have been taking evergreen branches, for example, of evergreens, mistletoe, juniper, holly, or other pine tree branches into the houses during. It has been important to put it into the houses as a way of protection, warding off evil, and as a symbol of life, basically, during this time of death and darkness.
But the first notion of an evergreen tree-like object comes from the late 1400s. It's a pole stuck up outside, decorated with evergreen branches. And we know of one, at least one in London, and two in the Baltic area, Estonia and Latvia, where German merchants had set up trading posts. Now, as to who is the first, it's a heated topic in Estonia and Latvia.
The story of the Christmas tree is documented in the Brotherhood of Blackheads Chronicles from the year 1509-1510, written in the Old German language. According to the chronicles, logs were burned during the winter solstice in pagan traditions, and it's likely that the first Christmas tree was originally meant to be set on fire at Town Hall Square in Riga.
Riga claims to have put up the first ever Christmas tree in this very town square right here in the year 1510, it says on the ground. This is obviously a big tourist attraction because, Christmas trees are European-wide tradition, everyone knows about them. Lots of tourists have come along and taken their photo with this. The only issue is that Estonia, where I've just come from, also claims to have put up the first Christmas tree in 1441 in Tallinn Town Square by the Brotherhood of Blackheads Merchant Association.
In the 1500s, say, half a century or so later, people are moving the trees inside. This happens in Germany. They will go out into the forest and lop the top off an evergreen tree. They'll bring it inside and they'll hang it upside down from the ceiling. By the late 1500s, people start cutting down the whole tree and bringing it inside and setting it, we would say, right side up.
It becomes a great fashion across Germany in the 17th, 18th centuries, and German refugees fleeing from Napoleon bring it to England, the 1790s, 1800s. And it becomes an English fashion, largely because of one very influential German. He's Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who introduces it to the royal family in the 1840s. And that's when it becomes a pretty well universal tradition.
Probably the true association of the Christmas tree came also from Germany, where they would conduct these paradise plays during the Christmas season, in which it was very popular to have the tree in the Garden of Eden, and they would represent the first sin when Adam and Eve fell. The focal point of this play was a pine tree, and that gradually moved into the homes of Christians who would, on that tree, they would have fruit hanging on it, representing the first tree in the Garden of Eden, and then they would also put little wafers representing the body of Christ.
But what I think is interesting is that when this Yule tree tradition came or returned from the south, then lots of Christians were upset about it because they thought it was a pagan tradition. And then some other people came and said, no, it's not a pagan tradition. This is a symbol of the tree in the Garden of Eden.
Trees, especially evergreen trees, are very important in ancient symbolism. A lot of northern pagan peoples have the idea of one enormous tree that connects all the levels of the world, from the top of the sky through to the underworld.
In scientific thought, we always ignore the irregular, the exception to the rule. In magical thought, it's the reverse. The ordinary doesn't attract attention, the unusual does. So because the tree remains green when all other trees are dead, this gives special significance to the evergreen tree. What's ever unusual is magical and powerful. Now, we have a Christian source. It may not be reliable, but it could be. Describes this tree in Uppsala, Sweden. We have reason to believe our modern Christmas tree is a grossly distorted version of this. Now, it's described by Christians, though, as a center of what they would view as a horrific human sacrifice cult. But this is during Easter now, time of life. So it's been switched. And it's this large tree, and they would sacrifice every 9 years dogs, horses, and humans, and hang them from the tree. And there's reason to believe that Christmas ornaments hanging from the tree, probably symbolizing originally maybe a dead human hanging from a tree.
One of the hallmarks of the Protestant Reformation was this desire to restore the purity of the Apostolic Church. And this desire led to a wholesale re-evaluation of the entire edifice of Christian worship. And Calvinists, Puritans, and other more radical groups went particularly far in this regard. They essentially rejected large parts of the liturgical year as not being grounded in Scripture. And Christmas was an easy target from this perspective, because obviously the date of Christ's birth is never mentioned in the Gospels. There's no injunction to celebrate his birth either. And then as now, it was the case that the religious content of Christmas was overshadowed by popular folkloristic customs and traditions, some of which were quite raucous. And it was easy to believe that some of those customs have pagan roots. And it was also widely believed amongst reformers that the Catholic Church is mired in the vestiges of Roman paganism. So this argument came to be that they thought, well, they foisted Christmas on Christianity, even though it's not really a Christian feast. It's some kind of vestige of Roman paganism. And in the case of Christmas, the example they pointed to is the birth festival of the Roman sun god, Sol Invictus, which means the unconquered sun.
The reformers everywhere in Europe would say that the Roman Catholic Church made compromise after compromise for 1,400 years to appease the people. And they brought in all sorts of non-scriptural things, non-Christian things, and that the church in 1500 looked nothing like the church in 100 or 200. And the biggest part of the Reformation was to roll back all the compromises that had been made in that 1200, 1300 year period and return the church to its original purity.
Presbyterians don't realize today that the Reformed churches in the Reformation suppressed Christmas celebrations as well because they understood it was pagan.
So I was raised a Catholic, but and everything was a sin, just about. So, yeah, they have encyclopedias of sin. So,
Really?
Just like, you know.
We didn't have those in my church.
I couldn't. No, there's no sin to celebrate Christmas. Or not to celebrate Christmas either. It's up to the person.
if we're saying that we're celebrating his birth, then why is everything that we're doing all about us and our family and
what we want to do?
What we want to do?
The new wave of reformers are dead set against the cult of saints. So out goes St. Nicholas. And that leaves parents asking the question, okay, so who's going to be the magical gift bringer now? Catholic countries save St. Nicholas. And in some pockets of Protestant Europe, like the Netherlands, they save St. Nicholas as well. Nobody is bringing gifts to kids in England, period, for centuries. There's no magical gift bringer. But in other countries, it becomes the Christ child. A perfect theological solution. God brings us everything good, so why not say to the children, the baby Jesus, the Christ child, das Christkindl, le petit Jésus, has brought you this.
So having Santa bring gifts and having the Christ child bring gifts is like, that's a big issue. People will have stickers, in really traditional areas, they'll have stickers in their windows with a slash through Santa Claus or the Christmas man saying, no Weihnachtsmann here.
And the ironic thing is, I think it was in Germany they came up with the Christkindl term, which means Christ child, because they were trying to kind of turn the focus back to Jesus to say, He's the real giver of gifts, and our greatest gift was his own life, giving himself. But it's ironic because I always thought that term meant, I thought it was synonymous with St. Nicholas, but it actually means Christ child.
Christmas goes into a decline in England and the English-speaking world after King Charles II comes back to power in 1660 and the Puritans are booted out. People have lost the taste for Christmas in that period, or at least to say the upper class seems to have lost its taste for Christmas. Christmas becomes associated with peasants, the lower classes, the countryside. Over the next 150 years, by 1800, both in England and in American colonies, particularly in northeastern America, Christmas has turned into an outdoor New Year's Eve bash. It's associated with adults, alcohol, making a nuisance of yourself, jostling prosperous citizens off the sidewalk, burning down churches belonging to African Americans, beating up immigrants, all the kind of stuff you like to do if you're a thug on New Year's Eve. So that's what Christmas is associated with. You look at some of the illustrations in England at that time period, and does not seem to be a time of religion or generosity.
Why was Christmas once illegal in America?
Dang.
You could even be fined for celebrating it.
Oh, wow. Whoa. I have no idea. Would it have been, so I don't know what Christmas was like before like the 1900s. So I'm not really like, would that have been just, would that have to do with the paganism, or would that have to do with maybe the something, I don't know. Well, could you tell me?
In northeastern United States, it was outlawed. The states settled by the Puritans, like Connecticut, Massachusetts, didn't like Christmas, didn't want to have anything to do with it. And apparently, it was right until the 1870s that Christmas Day was a school day, a work day.
Yeah, well, the Puritans were real killjoys.
Yeah, they weren't much fun.
If you go to the American Antiquarian Society, there'll be sermons against the evils of Christmas. The colony records of Massachusetts and the colony records of Connecticut, you can find the laws right there. They thought Christmas was an immoral holiday.
If you were in America, in Boston in 1810, Christmas was ignored. Boston was overwhelmingly Protestant, and it was just a normal day.
And I remember in England they had the same kind of laws. people got really rowdy, so they kind of banned it.
From the mid-1640s to 1660, Christmas is officially outlawed. Businesses had to be open on Christmas. If you shut down on Christmas, you were in trouble. The Sheriff of London would go around and pull down greenery that he saw on the streets. Christmas services were broken up by the police, people thrown in jail. So Christmas carols were silent, Christmas services silent, Christmas festivities were silent for those periods. And it becomes a social problem in both England and northeastern United States. There are in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, gangs that take over the Christmas season and that swamp the ability of the police to handle it. So in New York, a group of artists and poets and writers try and domesticate Christmas, try and bring it indoors, focus it on the children.
The charity that was part of Christmas before that was charity to your to those socially below you, servants. So instead of the servants, we're giving gifts to children. So it's a way to sort of domesticate and quiet Christmas down.
And to do that, they resurrect St. Nicholas.
I think the first time it crossed my mind that there was something wrong was maybe when I was about 5. If we're celebrating Christ's birth, if it's his birthday party, why is Santa in the foreground?
Santa Claus, who the heck is Santa Claus? Santa Claus is a bastardization of the Dutch Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas. So we can tell that folk memory has preserved it because there is it's only oral. So we have Sandy Claw, Sandy Claus, Sinterklaas, Santa Claus, all one word.
This will sound rather unusual, but in fact, Santa Claus is really just a grossly distorted version of the pagan god Odin. He is the only Norse god routinely depicted as old.
There was still that connection where people were making between paganism, Yule and Christmas, so that might be part of it, is making Saint Nick kind of look like Odin a little bit. But do keep in mind that's just a theory, so.
Saint Nicholas walks or rides a white horse in most parts of Europe.
And the 8 flying reindeer? Those probably had their roots in Odin's flying 8-legged horse.
Now this is pagan, where they would celebrate Odin coming down on his horse, and they would put little shoes out with food in it for the horse, and Odin as a thanks would put candy or some kind of treats in that shoe and replace the hay or whatever they had put there for the horse.
Sometime around 1200, some Catholic nuns in an orphanage put a little gift in the shoes of their children that they're caring for on the eve of St. Nicholas Day. So the evening of December 5th. And kids wake up and there's something lovely and they say, St. Nicholas brought that. Well, it just seems like such a great idea. It spreads all across Europe. The real magic happens in a poem that appears in 1821 called A Children's Friend. This is a poem about the arrival on Christmas Eve of a figure called Santa Claus. And he's not wearing a bishop's outfit, he's wearing a long robe trimmed in fur. Nobody knows who wrote this, but this is a guy who started a revolution. The next year, one of these New York aristocrats that wants to domesticate Christmas tells to his family the poem that we know is The Night Before Christmas. And he's obviously read A Children's Friend because he comes down the chimney, clothed all in fur, except this time he's not a full-sized adult, he is some dwarfish figure, small enough to fit down a chimney.
Now Santa Claus enters the house through the chimney and leaves that way, and people miss the significance. In traditional lore, The sorcerer, the witch, the demon does not enter by the door. Your friend, an ordinary safe person, comes by the door. The thief enters by the window. Witches, sorcerers, demons enter through the chimney. And this old Santa Claus version, again, is a demonized version of Odin. He climbs down the chimney.
In this poem, there's no long black birchen rod. There's no horse manure in the stocking. There's no switches. This is a guy of whom you don't have to be afraid. So this notion of a grandfatherly, magical gift bringer who comes on December 24th in a reindeer-powered sleigh goes viral.
The crowd yelled, "There's the Elmos," and they rushed us.
I think there comes a point where the roots are so far gone that the present meaning doesn't carry the pagan connotation anymore.
I tend to follow more of a Wiccan-based paganism, but there are many different forms and types of paganism.
I personally celebrate Yule on the 23rd of December usually, just to kind of carry it on a little bit to join in with my family's festivities.
So we'll start with the gold candle and we'll turn towards the east. Grandmother,
I find it amusing when people say, put Christ back in Christmas, because if you are Christian and you really do want to follow, the teachings of Jesus, then yeah, it probably doesn't make much sense to have all of these kind of, pagan things that represent fertility, because that's not really about the birth of Jesus.
Some people say it's not likely that the Christians would have wanted to take a pagan festival and make it Christian. On the other hand, they do appear to have done so. So I think one needs to find some other way of explaining what's going on.
So if you go to the Vatican today, you'll be surprised to find full mosaics from pagan temples just in the church.
In the middle of the square is this giant obelisk there. That's not even a Roman thing. That's an Egyptian solar deity monument. It's created by the Egyptians to honor their sun god Ra.
There was a temple to Minerva. That later got converted into a church. And its modern name, the name of the church is Santa Maria Sopra Minerva, which means on top of Minerva.
The early Christians took on from paganism the shape of their churches, decorations like statues and hangings and altars and cloths, and a great many festivals, especially to those connected to obvious turning points of the year like midwinter and midsummer.
I tend to celebrate the 8 holidays most commonly associated with Wicca, and those are all based around the movement of the sun and the seasons. So the winter solstice Yule, or the summer solstice Litha, and then the 2 equinoxes where day and night are equal. And in the fall, the autumnal equinox would be Mabon, the vernal equinox would be Ostara. and then you have 4 points in between. So that's how you make the 8 holidays, which are all about recognizing those changes in the seasons.
Outside Christmas, there are plenty of synchronizations of pagan with later Christian festivals. May Day becomes the feast of the Apostles, Philip and James. Midsummer becomes the feast of John the Baptist. What we now call Halloween, the great pagan festival that opened winter, becomes the feast of All Saints and All Souls, and so you go on round the year.
Is it a sin to celebrate Christmas?
I don't think so, no. It's a joyous celebration. I mean, you're celebrating the birth of Jesus. No, but I don't know why. I mean, I don't know.
Is it a sin to celebrate Christmas?
So what Christianity has done over the centuries is to take stuff from the surroundings and tame it, Christianize it. So we don't have human sacrifices anymore. We consider that bad manners, but we have the Yule log. You know, we don't do druidic stuff, but we have the mistletoe. You know, we're not dancing naked in the streets, but we are giving little presents, like at Callan's, to kids.
For people that want to just, you know, say that it doesn't come from pagan origins, my opinion on that is, well, you're just turning a blind eye to what history has told us. I mean, these trends, these stories, this is scholars, the scholarly work that has been done. I like to look at Robert Weber, whose Institute of Christian Worship series is pretty much my go-to source. I mean, he documents these origins. It's there. Secular historians document these things. When we deny that these origins exist, we actually do disservice to Christianity's, and what I would actually say or argue, we do disservice to Christian intellect. And then we end up just coming across as these sort of dumb fundamentalists, and that's not helpful.
This is an important point. 19th century scholars discovered that rituals outlive beliefs. So what happens is the ritual continues, but we forget why we're doing it. And then we invent an explanation. And the 19th century scholars called this myth, to explain why we're doing something. You could also call it a rationalization.
A lot of words that we have today have pagan origins, Scandinavian false worship origins. For example, the days of the week. Saturn Day. I mean, Saturn is a false god. Is it wrong to say Saturday? Is it wrong to observe Thursday, which is Thor's day? Do we need to change all the names of the days of the week?
What we've both come to realize is that Christmas is something where you're literally saying that this is for me and I'm worshiping you. I'm celebrating you in this way. I'm not celebrating him by saying today's Friday. You know what I mean? Right? So it's like, I think it makes a big difference when you're actually doing something for him. Exactly.
What really is the bottom line for me is Deuteronomy chapter 12, not worshiping God the way we see other people worship their gods.
The way the pagans do.
That in itself is enough to not celebrate Christmas, knowing that Christmas is not in the Bible and taking that scripture.
But I want to suggest something, that we have liberty. We have liberty in Christ. Paul said, I become all things to all men that I may win some. The purity of trying to deny or trying to stay away from Christmas because of these pagan origins, I think is a total misunderstanding of the Bible in a classically evangelical theology that understands the whole narrative of the Bible. God redeems everything. So I don't look at passages in Deuteronomy and say, this is why I shouldn't celebrate Christmas. There's all kinds of things in Deuteronomy.
I would ask, where in Scripture do we find that, the Father redeemed anything from a pagan god's worship and redeemed it for himself? I don't see that anywhere in Scripture.
I would say it's really worth the risk if the date itself, December 25, was chosen because of some proximity to some kind of pagan festival. Let's just take it and sanctify and make the most of it because Christ is worthy to be celebrated in his birth.
So each time that you are presented with an image, imagine that the logo and branding are being proposed for use on your church. So if you're ready, let's begin. So this one is the triple goddess. The moon is the symbol of the goddess and its three phases: waxing, full, and waning.
This leaves me waning. If you're being redeemed from something, you don't bring it with you. Okay? I can change, but I shouldn't be still drinking, carousing, and doing all that stuff. Bringing the symbol of what it was with you, then having to say, oh, but it's been redefined, I think misses the point.
But the scriptures are very clear that we're not supposed to be mixing the holy with the unholy, right? And so just because something is tradition does not mean that it's right. There's a lot of things that are tradition.
What the different prophets were told to do with the symbols of Baal or Dagon or any of the other gods they ran into, they were to burn them, destroy them, not incorporate them. And that, I think, would be the foundation I would use. Even though that's an Old Testament example, I still believe that it's more true.
If we're going to take that legalistic approach to Christmas, then we're going to have to rethink a whole lot of things. And my personal opinion is I reject that interpretation that says because Deuteronomy said this, we shouldn't do that. Deuteronomy says a lot of things. So am I moderate? Am I, bordering on the edge of heresy? You be the judge.
I think everything should be tested, and every person needs to test everything that they see. And the Word of God is the best way to test everything that you see. And